Hello, 6th grade. This is Mrs. Froman, and we're going to be taking notes on Chapter 1, Section 2 on populations today. The first vocabulary word we're going to talk about is density. Density is how many things are in one area, how closely packed they are in together. So when we talk about populations, we talk about the density of the population, or how many of that species are in that one area. So there's a few different ways scientists use to find the populations of wild animals. One of those is direct observation, which means just that. You count every single animal, which it would be a pretty big job if you had to do that for all the animals in the world. So that's one that they just use for smaller populations of animals. Then there's indirect observation, and this is where they use tracks and signs like their nests or dens, the food sources, like if bears scratch on trees, things like that, that show that there's been a bear that has gone by that area. Another way is called sampling, and this is where they estimate the amount of animals by counting the number in a small area. So if I wanted to find out how many grasshoppers lived on the prairie here at school, I could we have a 7-acre prairie. If I figured out how many grasshoppers lived in a half an acre, then I could estimate how many lived in all 7 acres. I would just take that number and multiply that. Since there's 14 1/2 acres in 7 acres, I'd multiply that number of grasshoppers by 14 to estimate the population in the whole prairie. So that's one they use pretty commonly, because then you just have to find out a population in a small area. Then there's something called mark and recapture, and this is pretty commonly used. This is where you catch the animals and put a tag on them of some kind, and then let them go again, and then in the next year you go back and catch them again, and the ones that you catch that have tags on, and you have some that were caught without tags, there's a formula they can use to find out what the number of the population is. If you've ever been to the bird banding station, it's out Colored Sands Forest Preserve, kind of out by the Williams Tree Farm, kind of past that area. They catch birds and put bands on their legs every fall and every spring, and then they use that information to figure out the population of the birds in the area as they're migrating. So how do these populations change? There's 3 main ways that populations can change. One is birth and death, if the new ones are born or the older ones die. Then there's immigration, which means moving into a population. So, and just say there's a herd of deer and a new deer comes and joins that herd, that would be immigration, moving into that population. Emigration, starting with an E, is just the opposite. That's moving out of that population. So if we had a herd of deer and a deer left to go find better food somewhere, then that would be emigration, and that population is going down because that deer has left. And then lastly, we have something called limiting factors. And limiting factors are things that prevent a population from increasing. So it's not like a population can just keep going and going and going forever. There's things that keep them from getting too big. So those 3 things are weather, space, and food. So when you're talking about animals, the weather, if we have a really hard winter, let's just with our deer in the area, if we have a lot of snow and it's very cold, that's going to affect that deer population. They're probably going to get sick more often because of the cold weather. They won't be able to find food as easily because of the deep snow. So that will limit how many deer can actually survive. Space is another one. So there's certain animals that need a lot of space to live. Like a deer, you can't just keep a deer in your backyard and expect it to survive. It needs a lot of land to find its food and all the things it needs to live, its mates, its place to live. And then the last thing is food. If there's not enough food in the ecosystem, it's going to limit how many animals can live in that ecosystem. And all of these things are kind of related to our last vocabulary word, carrying capacity. And that's the largest number that the environment can support. So a lot of this has to do with how much food is there, how many places there are to live in that ecosystem. You can't have 3 different families of bears sharing the same den, because they're not going to get along very well together. So yeah, there has to be enough room for all of them to live. So that's your space and your food, and of course the weather is also going to affect that carrying capacity. So a really harsh environment, there's not going to be as many animals that can live in that kind of weather. All right, so that's our notes, and make sure you do your QUOC for this, your question, wonder, observation, or connection, and we'll see you next time. Bye.